The summons came the way an avalanche comes, quietly, from very high up and then all at once. It arrived encoded in the old diplomatic band, the one humanity had been permitted to receive but never quite invited to use, and it unfolded across the bridge of the courier ship Meridian Post in the flat, gilded script of the Concord itself. There was no greeting in it. The elder species of the galaxy did not greet the young, they instructed them. And the instruction, stripped of its filigree and its seals and its many-throated invocations of law older than Earth's oceans, amounted to a single sentence that Adaeze Okonkwo would carry in her chest like a swallowed coal for the rest of the voyage. Humanity would appear before the ring of threshold in 90 days, and humanity would pay. She read it 3 times before she let herself breathe. Adaeze was 26 years old, which in the reckoning of the Concord made her barely more than an idea of a person, a thing not yet finished forming. She was the second of the human delegation, which was a polite way of saying she carried the first's coat and remembered the first's appointments and was permitted to speak in the chamber only if the first fell silent. She had trained for this the way a swimmer trains for a river she has only ever seen in maps, relentlessly, and with no real knowledge of the cold. She had memorized 1,100 articles of the Concord Codex. She had learned to hold 4 cups of ceremonial tannin without her hands shaking. She had practiced the 16 degrees of the seated bow until her spine ached, because a bow given at the wrong depth to the wrong archon could unmake a treaty. What she had not practiced was walking into the chamber alone. But the first, Ambassador Hoxa, had taken ill on the 80th day. A slow bleeding thing in his brain that the Meridian Post surgeon could stall but not stop, and by the time the courier ship slid out of the fold and into the long amber light of the threshold, Hoxa could no longer form the vowels of his own name. He gripped Adaeze's wrist in the medical bay, his eyes enormous and afraid, and he tried to give her a lifetime of counsel with a hand that could only squeeze. She squeezed back. She told him she would manage. She was not certain it was true, and she suspected he knew it, and they let the kindness stand between them anyway because there was nothing else to hold. So it was Adaeze Okonkwo, second and now, by the cruelty of arithmetic first, who stood at the forward viewport of the Meridian Post and watched the ring of threshold resolve out of the dark. It was the largest made thing she had ever seen, and she had grown up in the shadow of orbital yards. The ring was a band of pale stone and darker metal, a circle wide enough to hold a small world inside it, hung in space around a single dying star. The Concord called that star the Everlight, though there was little light left to it now. It had been, the record said, a beacon once, a great steady lamp that the elder species had tended across 100,000 years, a hearthstar under which the first treaties of the galaxy had been sworn. Fleets had oriented by it. Pilgrims had crossed empty parsecs to warm themselves in its glow. It was not merely a star to them. It was the physical proof that the Concord endured, that some things were permanent, that the old order held. And it was going out. Even Adaeze, who knew almost nothing of stellar mechanics, could see the sickness in it. The Everlight had gone the color of a bruise healing badly, a sullen ochre shading to gray at its poles, and long dark filaments crawled across its face like cracks across old glaze. Around it the ring glittered with 10,000 ships, and every one of them, she understood with a lurch, had come to watch what happened to the humans. The dying of a star made a fine backdrop for the humbling of an upstart species. The Concord had a genius for staging. They chose this place on purpose, said Captain Reyes from behind her. Ilan Reyes commanded the Meridian Post's escort, a lean gray cruiser named the Longstride that rode 100 kilometers off the courier's flank. He was aboard by shuttle for the approach, and he was young too, 31, with the particular flat calm of a man who had learned early not to spend fear he might need later. He and Adaeze had known each other for 6 weeks and trusted each other for 5 of them, which by the standards of that voyage made them nearly family. "Tell me how you mean," Adaeze said without turning. A dying star, a ring full of witnesses, they want us small. He came to stand beside her. You get a species out to the edge of a place like this, make them look at something that's been alive since before their sun cooled, and then you hand them a bill. It's not about the money, it's theater. They want us to feel the weight of all that age pressing down and pay just to make the weight stop. It is about the money, Adaeze said quietly. It is also about the money. Because the bill, when the full instrument of it had finally decrypted, was not small. The Conquered called it the Warden's Toll. The reasoning, laid out across 900 lines of codex citation, ran like this. Humanity had, in its brief and clattering expansion, sent its ships through a corridor of space that the Conquered had held and warded since antiquity, the Threshold Reach, the graveyard region around the Hearthstar, where the old powers buried their honored dead and stored the relics of their founding. Humanity had passed through it without license. Humanity had, in the Conquered's phrasing, taken the safety of warded space without paying the Warden. And now that humanity had grown fat enough to notice, the Warden had come to collect. The toll was itemized. It demanded matter, the mass of a small moon in refined metals and rare isotopes, to be delivered in installments over 3 human generations. It demanded transit rights. Humanity would cede exclusive claim to 4 of its own frontier systems, holding them thereafter only as tenant to the Conquered. And it demanded a thing the Codex called acknowledgement, a formal, recorded, unretractable statement that humanity had trespassed, that it owed, and that its continued existence in the wider galaxy was a courtesy extended by its betters rather than a right the universe had granted it. That last clause was the one that made Adaeze's hands go cold, the matter they could survive, the systems they could grieve and lose, but acknowledgement was a chain forged not of iron but of precedent. Sign it, and every future demand would rest on it. Sign it, and humanity would spend the next 10,000 years paying interest on a debt it had never truly owed, because it had once, when it was young and frightened and alone at the edge of a dying star, agreed that it was guilty. They think we'll pay the matter to keep the systems, Adaeze murmured, more to herself than to Raze. And they think we'll cede the systems to avoid the acknowledgement. They've built it like a staircase. Each step looks better than the one below it, and every step goes down. Raze was quiet a moment. Can we refuse? Anyone can refuse, she said. The question is what refusing costs. She nodded toward the glittering swarm around the ring. Among the 10,000 ships, a formation had begun to detach itself and drift toward the approach lanes. Long, faceted vessels the color of old ivory, arranged in a wedge that no one could mistake for ceremony. Those are Sephrite, the bankers of the Conquered. They hold the toll and they hold the fleet that enforces it. If we refuse and they decide we've insulted the whole order by refusing, that wedge stops being an honor guard and starts being a blockade. And the long stride is one ship, Ilan. One good ship. Against that, Raze agreed without flinching, which she noted and was grateful for. The Meridian post was hailed then formally, and cleared to dock at the human berth, a spur on the inner rim of the ring so far from the ceremonial heart that reaching the chamber would take a 2-hour transit through the station's arteries. Another small humiliation, precisely calibrated. Adaeze accepted it with a bow of exactly the correct depth to the receiving officer's image, and she did not let her face show that she had counted the insult and filed it. They gave her 1 night before the first session. She did not sleep in it. Instead, she sat in the cramped delegation office aboard the docked courier, with the full codex spread across every surface she could light. And she did what she had always done when the world was too large to fight. She read. She read the Warden's Toll again, forward and backward, following each citation down into the deep strata of Conquered law, where the language turned archaic and the meanings forked. She read the founding articles of the Threshold Reach, the Warden right, the Toll right, the long dry poetry of an order that had governed the galaxy before humanity had learned to smelt bronze. And somewhere past the 3rd hour, in an appendix so old its citations pointed to species that no longer existed. She found a word that made her stop. Reciprocity. The Concord Codex, for all its weight, rested on a single stone at its foundation, and that stone was balance. The elder species had built their entire order on the idea that debts must be paid, but the same articles that made a debt binding also made its opposite binding. A toll owed to a warden could be discharged not only in matter but in service rendered. And a service rendered to the conquered, if it went unclaimed at the time, did not evaporate. It accrued. It waited in the ledger of the order like a coal banked under ash, and it could be called upon, the appendix said, by the one who had performed it or by their inheritors, at any time in any forum, to set against any claim. The codex had a name for it. It called it the weight of the saved. Adaeze sat very still. She was thinking, suddenly and vividly, of a story she had heard as a cadet and half forgotten. A story that had circulated through the human diplomatic service as a kind of bitter joke, because it was a story about how the galaxy had never once thanked humanity for anything. 19 years ago, a human survey ship called the Kestrel had been running a long, slow arc through an unnamed reach of space when it stumbled onto a disaster in progress. A migration fleet, 40,000 souls of a species humanity had never met, caught in the death throes of a star that had gone unstable a century ahead of every prediction. The fleet's own escort had already fled. The Kestrel was a survey ship, unarmed, undermanned, with no obligation and no orders, and no earthly reason to do anything but log the tragedy and move on. The Kestrel had turned into the fire instead. Its captain, Adaeze could not remember the name and cursed herself for it, had spent 9 days ferrying the migration fleet out of the expanding shock front one crippled arc at a time, running the Kestrel's fold drive so far past tolerance that it never worked right again. They had lost the ship's whole margin, half its consumables, and 2 crew to a hull breach. They had saved, by the final count, 38,000 of the 40. And then, because the survivors were desperate and stateless, and the Kestrel's captain had judged that a stranded people did not need a bill on top of a catastrophe, the human ship had escorted them to safe harbor and asked for nothing. No reciprocity claimed. No ledger opened. The Kestrel had simply limped home, filed a report that no one important read, and passed into service legend as the ship that saved a whole people, and got a commendation and a broken engine for its trouble. The species the Kestrel had saved were called the Ilmari. And the Ilmari, Adaeze knew, because she had memorized the whole roll of the chamber. Every seat and every sigil held a seat on the conquered. She stood up so fast her chair went over. "Ilan," she said into the calm, and her voice did something she had not expected it to do. It came out steady and low and certain. "Ilan, wake up. I need the Longstrides archive. I need every record we have on the Kestrel incident 19 years ago, the Ilmari migration. I need the ship's log, the survivor manifest, and I need to know if any part of the conquered ever formally acknowledged it happened." A pause thick with sleep, then waking, "You found something." "I found the bottom of the staircase," Adaeze said, "and I think it's got a door." She did not sleep that night either, but she stopped being afraid somewhere around the 4th hour, which was almost the same thing as rest. By the time the ring's great bells rang the opening of the first session, a sound that came up through the deck plates like the sea moving under a pier, Adaeze Okonkwo had washed and dressed in the plain dark coat of the human service, pinned the single silver bar of her office at her collar, and gathered into a slim folio the shape of an argument she was not yet sure she could win. Reyes met her at the airlock. He had put the Longstride on a discreet standby he called attentive, which she understood to mean that his gun crews were awake, and his reactor was hot, and he would say none of that aloud in a place that was surely listening. "You look like someone who slept," he said. "I look like someone who decided," she said. "It photographs the same." They went in together, the young captain and the younger first, down the long, bright artery of the ring toward the chamber where the oldest powers in the galaxy waited to tell a species barely 300 years off its homeworld exactly how much its existence would cost. Above them all, through every viewport they passed, the dying hearthstar burned its slow, sullen ochre, and no one in that vast and ancient place seemed willing to look at it directly. It was, Adaeze thought, the most important thing in the entire ring, and the conquered had built 10,000 years of ceremony precisely so that no one would have to admit it was going out. She looked at it. She made herself look at it the whole long walk. She had a feeling she was going to need to remember exactly how it burned. The chamber of the conquered was called the Hall of Accounts, and it had been built to make anyone who entered it feel that they were being weighed. It rose in tiers, ring upon concentric ring of dark seats climbing toward a vaulted ceiling that showed, in slow-moving light, the whole map of the settled galaxy. Each tier belonged to a species of the order, and the tiers were arranged by age, not by power, not by numbers, but by how long a people had held their place among the stars. The oldest sat lowest and nearest the floor, in seats worn smooth by 100,000 years of use. The younger climbed higher, thinner, colder, until the topmost ring dwindled to a single empty gallery, so far from the floor that the being seated there would have needed instruments to see the speaker's face. That topmost gallery was where the ushers directed the humans. Adaeze climbed to it without complaint. She had expected it. She sat and Reyes sat beside her, and below them the Hall of Accounts filled with the shapes of the old galaxy. The vast gray bulks of the Thren, jurists and keepers of the Codex, whose folded trunks brushed the floor as they read. The drifting luminous Medusae of the Cephaline, who had given up bodies for light so long ago that they spoke in colors. The armored, patient Vorager, soldier philosophers who had not lost a war in 40,000 years and had therefore stopped fighting them. Species she had memorized as sigils on a chart resolved into breathing weight, and the sheer mass of accumulated time in that room pressed down on her exactly as Reyes had warned it would. And at the floor, in a crescent of pale faceted seats nearest the speaker's dais, sat the Sephrite. They were beautiful in the way that a knife is beautiful. Tall, translucent, their bodies grown of a living crystal that caught the chamber's light and threw it back sharpened. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and when they spoke, the sound came not from any mouth but from the resonance of their whole structure, a chiming that the translators rendered into words a half-second late, so that every Sephrite sentence seemed to arrive already carved. Their archon rose to open the session. Adaeze knew the name from the toll's seals. Adaeze Sunder, first accountant of the conquered, the being who had drafted humanity's bill. The chamber sees the human delegation, Adaeze Sunder chimed, and the translation slid a half-beat behind, cold and clear. It sees that the delegation is diminished. Where is the one called Hoxa, who was named to answer? The first ambassador is gravely ill, Adaeze said, and stood, because the topmost gallery had no rule against a speaker standing, and she wanted the whole chamber to have to lift its eyes to find her, even a little. I am Adaeze Okonkwo. I speak for humanity in his place. A rustle moved through the tiers. She could not read all of it, but she read the shape of it, surprise and something adjacent to contempt. She was young. She was alone. She had not even the seniority to have a title worth translating. The chamber notes the substitution, said Adaeze Sunder, and there was satisfaction buried in the chime, the pleasure of a merchant who finds the other side of the table has sent a child. It will simplify matters. A first long in service might have wasted the chamber's time with objection. Perhaps the newer voice will see the account plainly. Humanity owes. The threshold reach was warded before humanity's star had planets. Humanity crossed it uncounted times, taking safety it did not purchase. The toll before you is not punishment. It is arithmetic. The chamber does not ask whether humanity agrees. It asks only when humanity will begin to pay. And there it was, the trap, laid open and gleaming the whole staircase in a single sentence. When will you begin? Not whether. Answer the when and you have conceded the whether. Adaeze had walked in expecting exactly this, and it still took a discipline she had not known she owned to keep from flinching under the weight of 10,000 watching eyes and answer the question that had not been asked. Before humanity answers when, she said, humanity would ask the chamber to confirm a matter of law, because if I am to advise my people to pay a debt, I owe them the courtesy of being certain the debt is real. The debt is in the Codex, Adaeze Okonkwo said. The Codex is not in question. No, Adaeze agreed. The Codex is not in question. I have read it, all of it. A murmur at that, she heard it and did not slow. I have read the warden right and the toll right, and I do not dispute them. Humanity did cross the threshold reach. If the crossing created a debt, then let the debt stand. She let that hang, let the Sephrite crescent settle into the comfort of a concession, and then she set her hook. I ask the chamber only this. Under the Codex may a debt be discharged by service rendered, not only in matter but in a service performed for the good of the order and never claimed. Below her, among the great gray bulks of the thren, something shifted. The jurists knew where she was going. She saw the nearest of them unfold a fraction, the enormous slow attention of a creature that had spent 40,000 years watching young species try, and fail, to find the one loose stone at the bottom of the wall. Adaeze Okonkwo did not hesitate, because to hesitate would have been to admit the question mattered. The Codex provides for it. Service rendered may set against debt owed. This is elementary, but humanity has rendered no service to the conquered. Humanity is 3 centuries old. It has taken. It has not given. The provision is real and it is empty, envoy. You have found a door in a wall with nothing behind it. Then I will ask the chamber to open the ledger, Adaeze said, and let us see together whether it is empty. It was, she would think later, the single boldest sentence she had ever spoken, and she spoke it in a voice that did not shake, and she never afterward understood where that voice had come from, except that she had spent a night with the dying star, and it had burned some of the fear out of her. The chamber did not open ledgers on the request of a 300-year-old species from the highest and coldest gallery, but the chamber could not refuse either, without conceding that it was afraid of what the ledger held, and the conquered had built its entire dignity on the premise that it feared nothing, least of all its own accounts. Adaeze Okonkwo was caught in the same machine it had built. The first accountant could not deny an appeal to the ledger without ceasing, in that instant, to be an accountant at all. The chamber will recess. A thren jurist rumbled, before Adaeze Okonkwo could answer, and Adaeze understood that the old jurists had just done her an enormous, deliberate favor, because they wanted to see the ledger too. The keepers will retrieve the record of service, the human delegation asserts. The chamber reconvenes in one turning. Let the account be read in full, as the Codex requires, before the young. It has been long since we did a thing merely because it was correct. The great bells rang. The hall of accounts began to empty. Adaeze leaned close as they descended the endless stair. What just happened? I bought a day, Adaeze said, and I made the whole galaxy curious about a survey ship it forgot 19 years ago. Now I need the ledger to actually say what I think it says, or I've just walked us both off a cliff in front of 10,000 witnesses. And if it does say it, then the Sephrite lose their toll and they will not forgive us for it, and we will need to be somewhere very defensible when they realize it. She glanced at him. How attentive is the long stride exactly? Very, Adaeze said, gets more attentive by the hour. The recess was not restful. Within the turning, 19 human hours, the pressure began, and it came from every direction at once, the way pressure always does when an old order senses a young one has found leverage it did not sanction. The human birth's docking clamps were found to require inspection, locking the meridian post in place. The station's law wardens requested, with exquisite courtesy, that Captain Adaeze surrender the Longstride's fold coordinates for the safety of the ring. A Sephrite functionary arrived at the delegation office with a revised instrument of the toll, reduced, generously reduced, the moon's mass cut by a third, the acknowledgement clause softened to something that could almost be read as mutual, and the clear unspoken message that this gift would expire the instant the ledger was opened. Take the smaller chain now, or gamble the whole thing on a 19-year-old rescue and lose. Adaeze read the revised instrument twice, thanked the functionary with a bow of precisely correct depth, and declined. "You understand," the functionary chimed, gathering its crystal length, "that the first accountant offered this from goodwill. Goodwill once spent does not return. When the ledger is read and found wanting, the toll returns to its full weight, and the chamber will remember that humanity chose pride over prudence. You are very young, envoy. The young mistake stubbornness for strength. I have watched 100 species make this error at this very ring. I have watched most of them cease to matter." "I have counted them too," Adaeze said. "The species that ceased to matter. Do you know what I noticed, reading the roll of this chamber? Every empty seat in the Hall of Accounts belonged to someone who paid. Not one of them belonged to someone who refused. The Conquered has 10,000 years of records, and in all of them there is no example of a people that was destroyed for saying no, only of peoples that were slowly emptied out for saying yes, one clause at a time, until there was nothing left of them worth a seat." She stood. "You call it prudence. From up in the highest gallery it looks like a very long way to fall, one step at a time, agreeing the whole way down. I would rather find out what is behind the door." The functionary regarded her for a long, chiming moment, and then it said something the translator delivered flatly, without inflection, which somehow made it worse. "Then find out, and may you have the ship to survive being right." When it had gone, Adaeze let out a breath. That sounded like a threat. "It was information," Adaeze said. "They think the ledger might actually favor us. That functionary would not have come to soften the toll if the Sephrite were certain the record was empty. They are hedging. That means we're close." She rubbed her eyes, and for a moment the exhaustion showed, the weight of a thing far too large for one 26-year-old to be holding alone. "The problem is that being close isn't being safe. Even if the ledger names us as creditor, Ilan, even if I stand up tomorrow and prove that humanity gave the Conquered 38,000 lives and never sent a bill, that only wins the argument. It doesn't win the room. These are beings who have watched galaxies turn. Some of them will decide that a species clever enough to find the one loose stone is a species too dangerous to let keep it. Winning the ledger might be the thing that gets us blockaded." "Then we win the ledger," Adaeze said, "and we make it so nobody in that ring can stomach the cost of moving against us anyway. You do the law. I'll handle the part where one gray cruiser has to look like it's worth the whole Sephrite fleet not to fight." Adaeze looked at him. "The Longstride is one ship." "The Longstride is one ship," Adaeze agreed. "But they don't actually know what it can do. Nobody out here has ever seen a human warship do the thing it was built to do, because we've never had a reason to show them. Fear of a known quantity is arithmetic, they can price it. Fear of an unknown one is something else." A thin smile. "Let's not tell them the number, let's let them imagine it." It was then, in the small hours before the ledger was to be read, that the Ilmari came. There were 3 of them, and they came without announcement, up the long stair to the human gallery in the dim of the station's night cycle, small, quick, quiet beings, no taller than Adaeze's shoulder, their skin the mottled gray gold of river stones, their eyes very large and very dark and ringed with a fine tracery of bioluminescence that pulsed when they felt something they could not say. They did not sit. They stood before her, the 3 of them, and the eldest reached into a fold of its plain robe and drew out an object and held it forward on both palms, the way one offers a thing that has been carried a very long way. It was a fragment of hull plating, scorched black along one edge, cut clean along the other, no larger than a dinner plate, and stamped into it, faded but unmistakable in the plain block letters of a human shipyard that had closed before Adaeze was born, was a single word. Kestrel. We kept it, the eldest Ilmari said, and the translator caught the tremor in the chime of its voice, a thing the Sephrite's crystal tones never carried. 19 years we kept it. Our people took it from the ark your ship towed clear of the fire, the last ark, the one that lost its drive in the shock front and would have burned but for the line your captain would not cut. We did not know your language, we could not read the word, but we knew it was the name of the thing that saved us, and so we kept it and we passed it down and we waited. The great dark eyes lifted to hers. We did not know your people would ever come to this ring. We did not know there would ever be a day when the keeping mattered, but we kept it. And tomorrow, envoy, when they open the ledger and the Sephrites say humanity gave the conquered nothing, we will stand. We have waited 19 years to stand. Let us stand. Adaeze Okonkwo, who had not wept once in the whole long crossing, who had held her voice steady before 10,000 elder eyes, looked at the scorched fragment of a broken survey ship in the palms of a people it had saved before she was old enough to read, and found that she could not, for a moment, speak at all. Then she reached out, and she did not take the fragment, because it was not hers to take. She closed the eldest Ilmari's small hands gently around it instead. Keep it a little longer, she said. It should be you who shows the chamber, not me. In the last quiet hours before the ledger was read, Adaeze crossed to the Longstride. She told the station wardens it was a matter of retrieving records, which was true, and she did not tell them that she needed, just once before she gambled a species on an argument, to stand inside the thing she was going to stake it on. The shuttle ride was short. The airlock cycled, and then she was aboard a human warship for the first time in her life, and she understood, walking its spine, why Rays never explained the lance to anyone who asked. It was not what she had expected. She had expected a fortress. Instead, the Longstride was almost bare, long, clean corridors, spare and cold, everything stripped down to the two things it was built to carry, power and the instrument that shaped it. The reactor's hum came up through the deck plates like a held breath. And running the whole length of the keel, behind armored glass, was the lance itself, a spine of coiled resonance chambers and field emitters that did not look like any weapon she had ever seen, because it was not precisely a weapon at all. People always think it'll be guns, Rays said, walking her along it. Every species we've ever met, first thing they want to know is how many guns, and we let them keep thinking it because a gun is a number they can price. He rested a hand on the glass. This isn't a number. This is the thing my grandmother's generation built when they did the math on the galaxy we'd been born into and realized we'd never win a war of fleets. We're too young, too few. Anyone out here can outbuild us. So we stopped trying to outbuild them. We learned to reach for the biggest thing on any battlefield instead. The star, Adaeze said. The star. Rays looked at the lance the way other men looked at the sea. There's always a star, Ada. Every system worth fighting over has one, sitting there with more energy in a single second of its life than every fleet in the galaxy could spend in a war. Elder species look at a sun and see something holy or something eternal or something they build ceremonies around. We looked at it and saw the biggest weapon already on the field, and we built a ship that could pick it up. He tapped the glass. We've never had to use it against anyone. That's the part they don't understand. Nobody starts a fight with the ship that can flare their own sun. The lance has kept the peace for a century by simply existing, by being a thing no one can price and no one wants to test. And in all that time, it's never once mended anything, only threatened to break. A slow breath. So if you're going to stand up in that chamber and promise 10,000 of them a lit star, I want you to have stood here first and put your hand on the thing and know exactly what you're spending. Because we're about to take 100 years of peace through fear and set it against 100 years of goodwill, on one throw, in front of the whole galaxy. Adaeze put her hand on the glass. The reactor's hum came up through her palm, steady and enormous, the sound of a species that had refused to be small. They built this to break stars so they'd never have to, she said slowly, so no one would ever make us fight. She looked down the long, cold spine of the lance. Then this is the first honest thing anyone will ever have done with it. We break stars to keep from being conquered. Let's mend one to keep from conquering. Let the whole galaxy watch the only species that ever built a weapon like this use it, the one time it matters, to give something back instead of taking it. She lifted her hand from the glass and turned to him, and there was no fear left in her at all now, only the strange, clean certainty the dying star had put in her. They expect a young species to be reckless with power, Ilan, so let's frighten them properly. Let's be careful with it. Reyes looked at her a long moment. Then something eased in his flat, calm face, some last doubt settling. Careful, he said. I can do careful. He glanced down the lance one more time. Go win the ledger first. I'll have the biggest weapon in the galaxy warmed up and pointed at the one target nobody in 10,000 years ever thought to aim it at. And what's that? Mercy, Reyes said. We're going to aim it at Mercy and let them all watch us not miss. The Ledger of the Conquered was not a book. It was a chamber unto itself, sealed beneath the floor of the Hall of Accounts, and when the great bells rang the end of the recess, the whole vast tiered room reconvened to watch the keepers bring the record up into the light. The Thren did it themselves, 3 of the enormous gray jurists working in a slow choreography older than agriculture, and what they raised through the opened floor was a slowly turning lattice of stored light, a structure of recorded time so dense that looking at it too long made the eyes water. Every debt the conquered had ever recognized turned somewhere in that lattice. Every service, every account, open and closed, across 100,000 years. The chamber has asked the ledger a question, rumbled the eldest Thren, whose name, Adaeze had learned, was Asuar of the Deep Reading. The human envoy asserts that her species rendered a service to a member of the conquered and never claimed reciprocity. The Sephrite assert the ledger is empty of any such thing. The codex is clear. Where 2 parties dispute the account, the ledger answers, and the ledger does not lie because the ledger is the one thing in this order that no power has ever been permitted to edit. Not the Sephrite, not the Thren, not the founders themselves. The great head turned, slow and deliberate, toward the Sephrite crescent. Let that be remembered before we read. Adaeze caught the emphasis and understood it. Asuar was not neutral. Asuar was very old and very tired of a conquered that had become a machine for extracting tolls from the young, and Asuar had just, in front of the whole chamber, reminded the Sephrite that the ledger could not be bribed. The jurists wanted the account read honestly. It was the closest thing to an ally Adaeze had in that room, and it was an ally made entirely of process. Read it, said Veli Sunder, and the chime was cold now, the satisfaction gone out of it. The first accountant had spent the recess doing exactly what Adaeze had hoped it would not have time to do properly. It had gone looking in the ledger itself, and whatever it had found there, it had not been able to make disappear, because no power could edit the ledger. And so it had come to the chamber to try the only remaining strategy, which was to make the truth mean less than it did. Asuar spoke the query into the lattice, and the lattice turned and found the thread, and lifted it into the air above the floor for the whole Hall of Accounts to see. The record was complete. Adaeze had not been certain it would be. She had gambled on the conquered's own obsession with completeness, on the near certainty that a rescued people would have filed their survival with the order that governed them, and the gamble came home. There, turning in stored light above the floor of the oldest chamber in the galaxy, was the account of the Ilmari migration, the star that had died a century early, the flight, the abandonment by their own escort, and the arrival, on the 9th hour of the first day, of a single unarmed vessel of an unknown species. The ledger recorded the ship's designation in the Ilmari's own filing. It recorded 38,211 souls carried clear of the shock front. It recorded the human ship's departure, and beside that departure, in the cold, exact grammar of the Codex, it recorded the one detail that changed everything. Reciprocity, unclaimed. Balance, outstanding. Weight of the saved, carried against the order in favor of the vessel Kestrel and its inheritors in perpetuity until called. The Hall of Accounts made a sound Adaeze had not heard it make before. It was not a gasp. The elder species did not gasp. But it was the vast, slow, indrawn attention of 10,000 ancient beings all realizing the same thing at the same moment, and it moved through the tiers like wind through a wheat field, tier after tier bending toward the turning light. The ledger names a creditor, Asuar rumbled, and there was, unmistakably, something almost like joy buried in the ancient voice. The ledger names humanity. The ledger names a survey ship, Vali Sunder countered instantly, rising, its crystal length flashing as it caught the light of its own defeat and tried to bend it. A single vessel, an act of one crew, 3 centuries removed from the delegation now claiming it. The Codex permits inheritors to call an unclaimed service, but it does not fix the weight. 38,000 lives are a great thing, Chamber, no one denies it. But they were the lives of one people in 1 hour, 19 years past. The toll owed against humanity is the mass of a moon and the transit of ages. Weigh them honestly. A single ship's mercy against a debt of civilizations. The scale does not balance. It does not come close. The Sephrite turned, slow and gleaming, to face the human gallery, and its chimes sharpened to a point. Unless the envoy means to argue that 38,000 lives are worth a moon, let her put a price on them then, here, before the one she saved. Let her be the merchant she accuses us of being. It was, Adaeze understood at once, a very good trap, better than the first one. If she named a price for the Ilmaries' lives, she became exactly the thing she had condemned, a thing that weighed souls in tons of metal. If she refused to name one, the Sephrite would say the debt could not be measured, and therefore could not be set against a measured toll, and the whole account would collapse back into the moon, and the systems, and the chain. The old accountant had found the one move that turned her own victory into her defeat. She let the silence stretch. She let the whole chamber lean in, and then she did not answer the accountant. She turned instead, and she looked up, past the tiers, to a small gallery not far below her own, where 3 small gray-gold beings had risen to their feet. "I will not price them," Adaeze said, and her voice carried, because the Hall of Accounts had been built 10,000 years ago to carry a single honest voice to every seat. "The first accountant is right that I should not. A thing that can be priced can be sold, and a life that can be sold was never truly saved. So I will not tell this chamber what 38,000 lives are worth." She lifted her hand, palm open, toward the Ilmari gallery. "I will let the ones who were saved tell you instead. Chamber, the Codex grants a rescued people the right to speak to the weight of their own rescue. I invoke it. Let the Ilmari answer the accountant, not humanity, them." Asuar of the deep reading did not even wait for the Sephrite to object. "The right is real," the old jurist rumbled with evident relish. "The chamber recognizes the Ilmari." And the eldest Ilmari, in its plain robe, in the highest reaches of the coldest tiers, held up over the railing a scorched fragment of gray hull with a human word stamped into it, so that 10,000 of the oldest beings in the galaxy had to lift their eyes to see it. "We do not know what a moon is worth," the Ilmari said, and the translator caught the tremor and did not smooth it, and the tremor went out across the whole Hall of Accounts unsmoothed. "We are not accountants. We were farmers of light, and our star lied to us, and our own escort cut their lines and ran, and we were 40,000 people falling into a fire with no one left to catch us. And then something came, something with no reason to come. It had no weapons and no orders and no debt to us and no hope of payment, and it turned into the fire anyway, and for 9 days it did not stop, and when the last of us were aboard and the last Ark's drive was dead, their captain would not cut the toll line even when their own ship screamed. We did not know their name. We could not read this word. But we have carried it for 19 years, and we taught it to our children, and we will carry it after this chamber has forgotten us, because it is the name of the reason we exist." The great dark eyes swept the tiers, and the bioluminescence around them blazed. "The accountant asks what our lives are worth against a moon. We are not a moon. We are a people who are alive to stand in this chamber and say so. And every one of us is here, every child and grandchild of the 38,000, every life that has come after, every life that ever will, because a young species none of you counted for anything refused to do the arithmetic. Weigh that chamber. Weigh all of it. Weigh everyone who is alive today and everyone who will ever be born to us, because that is the true size of what your ledger calls the weight of the saved. And then tell us it does not balance a moon. The Hall of Accounts was utterly silent. Adaeze watched the arithmetic move through the room, because it was still, in the end, arithmetic to them, and that was the point, that was the whole hinge of it. The Sephrite had demanded the mass of a single moon. And the Ilmari had just, without meaning to, laid a very different number on the scale, not 38,000 lives, but every life those lives had made, and every life those would make, unfolding forward across all the centuries the conquered loved to measure. A rescued people was not a fixed weight, it was a compounding one. The old order that lived and died by its ledger had just been shown, in its own grammar, that the debt it owed a species called Kestrel was not a single mercy 19 years gone but a growing account, generations deep and still growing, and it dwarfed a moon the way a forest dwarfs a seed. The scale balances, Ossuar rumbled at last, and the old jurist did not bother to hide the satisfaction now. It more than balances. Read against the compounding weight of the saved, the warden's toll is not merely discharged. The conquered stands as debtor. The ledger names humanity creditor and the account runs the other way. The great head turned toward the Sephrite crescent. First accountant, your toll is void, and by the codex you invoke to raise it, the order now owes. It should have ended there. In a chamber that lived by its own law, it should have ended there, and Adaeze let herself feel, for one held breath, the wild, impossible lightness of having walked in alone and turned the whole account. Then Veli Sunder began, very slowly, to laugh, a chiming, terrible, cascading sound that the translator could not render into words, and did not try. "The child has read the codex," the first accountant said when the laughter had spent itself. "The child has read it beautifully, and the child believes the codex is what holds this order together." It rose to its full gleaming height, and it turned, not to Adaeze and not to Ossuar, but to the great vaulted ceiling and its slow map of the settled galaxy. "Let me teach the child the last article, the one that is written in no book. The conquered is not held together by its ledger. The conquered is held together by the Everlight. For 100,000 years the hearthstar has burned above this ring, and every treaty ever sworn was sworn beneath it. And it means that the order endures, that some things are permanent, that the strong tend the flame and the weak warm themselves at it, and this is the shape of the galaxy and always has been." The crystal length flashed. "And the Everlight is dying. The child has surely seen it. We have labored for 4 centuries to save it, and we cannot. And I put it to this chamber that a ledger is only law while the light still burns above it, and that when the hearthstar goes dark, so does every debt written beneath it, including the one this child has just so cleverly proven. So let us not speak of who owes whom. Let us speak of the dark that is coming for all of us. And let us ask what a species of 300 years imagines it can do about that." It was a magnificent stroke. Adaeze saw it land. Veli Sunder had lost the ledger and had simply refused to be bound by it, had reached past the law to the one thing older than the law, the dying star itself, and dared the whole chamber to care about a human accounting when the light that made accounting mean anything was guttering out over their heads. It moved the argument off the ground where Adaeze had won and onto the one ground where nobody had ever won, the ground of the failing hearthstar, and it did it in front of 10,000 witnesses who feared that dark more than they feared anything a human could ever say. The chamber began, tier by tier, to turn its eyes upward, toward the vault, toward the sick ochre light of the star none of them had been able to save. And Adaeze Okonkwo, 26 years old, alone in the highest gallery, looked up at the dying star too, and felt, rising in her chest, not despair, but the strangest and steadiest certainty she had ever known, because the first accountant had just, in its brilliance, made exactly the mistake she had spent all night hoping someone would make. It had dared humanity to do something about the dark. She keyed her collar calm, very quietly, so that only one man 100 kilometers away could hear her. "Ilan," she said, "how attentive is the long stride." A pause. Then across the void, the captain's voice, calm and ready, as if he had been waiting the whole time for exactly this question. "Say the word," Adaeze said, "and it's the most attentive ship in this ring." Adaeze did not answer Veli Sunder right away. She let the chamber keep looking up at the dying star, because she wanted them to be looking at it when she spoke, wanted the sick ochre light to be on every upturned face. She had spent the whole of the night before the first session reading the codex. But she had spent the hours of the recess reading something else, the Longstride Science Archive, and the 4 centuries of conquered records on the Everlight's decline, which the station made freely available because the conquered had long since stopped believing anyone could do anything about it and saw no reason to hide a grief. And in the small hours, with Adaeze patched in from the cruiser and the ship's stellar mechanics officer half asleep and increasingly awake, Adaeze had come to understand a thing that the oldest species in the galaxy had been unable to let themselves understand for 400 years. The Everlight was not dying of old age, it was being smothered. For 100,000 years the conquered had buried its honored dead and stored the relics of its founding in the threshold reach, in a dense reverent shroud of tombs and monuments and sealed arks, thousands upon thousands of them, hung in a great shell in close orbit around the hearthstar, so that the founders and the fallen would rest forever in its light. It was the most sacred space in the galaxy. And across 100 millennia, that shell of the honored dead had done what any shell of matter does when it orbits a star long enough. It had shed. Dust and heavy metal and the slow ablation of 10,000 centuries had rained inward, a fine ceaseless fall of the sacred into the fire, until the star's outer layers had grown thick with heavy elements that did not belong there, a cap, a lid, a smothering blanket of the very reverence the conquered had heaped upon it. The convection that should have carried the star's heat up from its core had stalled beneath that lid. The Everlight was not going out because its time had come. It was going out because it was being loved to death, buried under the weight of everyone who had ever wanted to rest in its glow. And the conquered could not save it, because saving it meant disturbing the shell of the honored dead, meant reaching into the most sacred space in the galaxy, and stirring the tombs of the founders and blowing the accumulated dust of 100,000 years of the beloved back off the face of the star. No power in the Hall of Accounts could bring itself to commit that desecration. They would sooner let the light die reverently than save it by disturbing the dead. Their reverence was the disease, and their reverence was also the reason they could never administer the cure. Humanity was 300 years old. Humanity had buried no one in that shell. Humanity could touch it. "First accountant," Adaeze said at last, and the chamber's 10,000 faces came down from the star to find her. "You are right. You have reached past the ledger to the one thing older than the ledger, and it was well done, and I will not pretend the account means anything if the light that made it goes out. So let us not speak of the account. Let us speak of the dark. You dared a species of 300 years to say what it imagines it can do about the dying of your star." She drew a breath. "Humanity imagines it can relight it." For a moment the translator delivered nothing, because for a moment no one in the Hall of Accounts said anything at all. Then the chamber erupted, not in shouting, the elder species did not shout, but in a rolling swell of chime and rumble and pulsing light that broke across the tiers like surf, disbelief and outrage, and a terrible sudden wild attention. 10,000 of the oldest beings in the galaxy all speaking at once, and none of them, for a few seconds, to her. Veli Sunder cut through it. "Blasphemy," the first accountant chimed, and the word rang cold and absolute through the hall. "The child does not even understand what she has said. To relight the Everlight, one would have to reach into the reliquary shell, into the resting place of every founder, every honored dead, 100,000 years of the conquered's beloved, and disturb it. Stir the tombs. Scatter the sacred. No power in this order has ever been permitted to lay a hand upon the shell, not to save the star, not to save the conquered itself. And now, a species 3 centuries old proposes to fly a warship into the Holy of Holies and blow the ashes of our founders off the face of the hearthstar as though clearing soot from a lamp. The crystal length blazed with real fury now, the first genuine emotion Adaeze had seen in it. This is not a rescue chamber. This is desecration dressed as one. I would rather the light go dark forever with the founders undisturbed beneath it, than watch it saved by the hands of the young. And I say that any species that even proposes this has proven itself exactly the reckless, graceless, unhallowed thing the toll was written to contain. And there it was, the true shape of the whole thing, laid bare at last in the middle of the Hall of Accounts. It had never really been about a moon's mass. It had been about this. The old order would rather die reverently than live by the mercy of the young. It would rather keep its dark sacred than accept a light it had not lit itself. Adaeze understood, looking down at the gleaming, furious length of Vayle's sunder, that she was not arguing with an accountant at all. She was arguing with grief. With the oldest grief in the galaxy, dressed up for 100,000 years as law. You would rather it go dark, she said quietly, and the quiet carried better than any shout. You have just told this chamber that you would rather the hearthstar die than let it be saved by hands you consider unworthy. First accountant, hear yourself. The founders you are protecting lit that star to be a beacon, to guide the lost, to warm the pilgrim, to burn steady over the swearing of every treaty so that no one who came after would ever have to be alone in the dark. That was what they built it for. And you would let it go out, you would let their beacon fail and their pilgrims wander, and their treaties be sworn beneath a corpse, rather than allow the exact kind of mercy it was built to shelter, because the ones offering the mercy are young. She shook her head slowly. I do not think you are protecting the founders. I think you are the last thing standing between them and the thing they wanted, and I think somewhere in this chamber there are those who know it. The shell is inviolate, Vayle's sunder said, but the chime had changed, had gone from fury toward something more brittle, the sound of a position that had just heard, distantly, the crack of its own foundation. The Codex forbids. The Codex, rumbled Asuar of the deep reading, forbids the desecration of the reliquary shell. It does not forbid its tending. The old jurist unfolded, slow and vast, and the whole chamber turned to the keeper of its law. I have read the Codex longer than any being in this hall, first accountant, and I tell you there is a difference, written in the founding articles in the founder's own hand, between one who scatters the dead in contempt and one who tends them in service. A gravekeeper who lifts a fallen stone and sets it right does not desecrate the grave. He honors it. The question before this chamber is not whether the shell may be touched. It is whether the human envoy proposes to desecrate it or to tend it. The great head turned. Envoy, answer the law. When your ship goes into the Holy of Holies, if this chamber permits it, what does it do to the dead? Adaeze had been waiting for the question, because Reyes and the Longstride stellar officer had spent the recess making certain she could answer it, not with a promise but with a plan. It touches none of them, she said. Hear me exactly, chamber, because I want the whole hall to hold me to this. The reliquary shell is not what smothers your star. What smothers it is the dust, the fine slow rain of ablation that 100,000 years of orbit has shed off the tombs and into the star's outer layers, a lid of heavy matter that has stalled the fire beneath it. My ship will not move one tomb. It will not scatter one founder. It will not lay a hand on a single sacred stone. What it will do is reach past the shell, into the star itself, and it will stir the fire back to life, restart the convection your own reverence stalled, and when the star breathes again, it will lift that lid of dust off its own face and burn it away as fusion light, and the shell will hang exactly where the founders hung it, untouched, in a hearthstar that shines again. She let that settle. The founders will not be disturbed. The founders will be warm. For the first time in 400 years, the light they built will fall on their tombs the way they meant it to. That is not desecration, Chamber. That is the only thing anyone has offered them in 4 centuries that is not surrender. The silence that followed was a different kind than before. It was the silence of a room recalculating. "You cannot do it," Veli Sunder said, but it was no longer an accusation of blasphemy. It had shrunk in the space of a minute into something almost plaintive. 4 centuries, the Voyager tried. The Cephaline tried, who are made of light and understand it as no flesh ever could. We have poured the wisdom of 100,000 years at this star, and it dies anyway. And you would have this chamber believe that a warship of a 300-year-old species, one ship, one gray ship of a people who were still burning wood when the ever-light began to fail, can do in an hour what the whole conquered could not do in 400 years. The chime found an edge of desperate scorn. On what possible ground does the child imagine her one ship can succeed where the galaxy failed? And this was the question Adaeze had wanted more than any other, because the answer to it was the answer to the whole story of her species, and she had been carrying it up the long stair since the first session without knowing whether she would ever be allowed to say it. "Because you tried to save it," she said, "and we build ships to fight." The chamber went still. "The Voyager tried to heal your star gently, because they are healers who stopped fighting wars 40,000 years ago. The Cephaline tried to reason with it, because they are light and they thought light would understand light. You all reach for the star the way a physician reaches for a patient, carefully, reverently, afraid to do harm." Adaeze's voice hardened, and something came into it that had not been there before, some old iron out of the deep of her young and violent and stubborn species. Humanity did not come up into a peaceful galaxy chamber. We came up into this one, a galaxy of elder powers and ancient tolls and staircases that only go down, and we understood very early that we were small and young and outmatched, and that no one was going to protect us, and so we learned to fight the only way the small can fight the large and live. We did not learn to build bigger guns. We learned to reach into the largest things in the universe and make them move. Our warships do not win battles by outshooting the enemy. They win by understanding stars, by lensing them, by stirring them, by turning the fire of a sun into a lever, because a species that can move a star does not need to outbuild anyone's fleet. She looked down at the gleaming length of the first accountant, and she was not afraid of it anymore, and every being in the Hall of Accounts could see that she was not. You could not save your star because you were too gentle with it. We can save it because we are not. The Longstride was built to break stars, first accountant. It has simply never, until today, been given a reason to mend one instead. She turned from Veli Sunder then, to the chamber entire, to the 10,000 tears of the oldest beings in the galaxy, and she made her offer plain, in words the conquered could not misfile. "Here are our terms, and they are the only terms humanity will offer, and we will offer them once. You demanded that humanity pay. We refuse to pay because we owe nothing. The ledger you yourselves cannot edit has said so, in your own hand, in your own law. But we will not leave your hearthstar to die to win an argument. So this is our reply." She lifted her chin. "We will relight the ever-light. We will call in the weight of the saved not as a moon of metal but as a single deed, one debt, one star, paid in full and forever. And when the light burns again over this ring, the conquered will strike the warden's toll from its ledger. It will record humanity as a people of the order and not a tenant of it, and it will let the debate that summoned us here end. Not because we were forced, and not because you were, but because there will be nothing left to debate under a sky that shines again." She spread her hands. "That is our answer to your demand, not payment, not war. A lit star. Decide, chamber, whether you would rather rule a dark one." The Hall of Accounts did not vote the way younger bodies vote. It did not need to. Asuar of the deep reading turned to the vaulted ceiling and its sick ochre light, and the old jurist said, into a silence so total that Adaeze could hear the station breathing around her, 4 words that unmade 100,000 years of who was permitted to touch the sacred. Let the young try. And 100 kilometers out, riding attentive off the human birth, one gray warship of a violent and stubborn and impossibly young species began, very quietly, to turn its nose toward the dying heart of the galaxy. They opened the whole vault of the Hall of Accounts to the void, so that the chamber could watch. It was a thing the conquered had done only for the swearing of the greatest treaties in its history, dilated the crystalline dome of the ceiling, until the hall itself looked out, unglazed, onto the naked heart of the threshold reach. 10,000 of the oldest beings in the galaxy arranged in their tiers beneath the open sky, with the reliquary shell hanging vast and silver-black before them, and the dying hearthstar smoldering sullen at its center. Adaeze stood at the rail of the highest gallery with the 3 Ilmari beside her, and none of them spoke, and far out across the dark the Longstride came on. It did not look like enough. That was the thing that struck her, watching it close the distance, one gray ship against the immensity of a smothered star. It was a lean thing, all spine and radiator fin, and the long forward keel that human shipwrights called the lance, and never explained to anyone who asked. Against the shell it looked like a needle laid against a cathedral. Against the star it did not look like anything at all. Ray's voice came into her ear, calm as a man reading a weather report. We're at the marker. Everything past this line is inside the shell. A pause. Ada, I want to say it plainly, on a channel this whole ring is listening to, so nobody can ever say we hit it. What we're about to do has been done exactly never. We've mended a few small stars in the deep dark where no one was watching, and it didn't matter if we were wrong. This one has been dying for 400 years, and it is the most sacred object in the galaxy, and there are 10,000 witnesses. If the stir goes wrong, we don't fail quietly. We fail in a way this whole chamber sees. The calm never wavered. I need you to tell me to do it anyway, because you're the one who gave the terms, and it should be you. Adaeze looked at the dying star. She looked at the Ilmari beside her, at the scorched fragment of the kestrel that the eldest of them still held cradled against its chest. She thought of Ambassador Hoxha squeezing her wrist in the medical bay, giving her a lifetime of counsel in a hand that could not form words. She thought of the whole long staircase the conquered had built, every step that only went down, and of how the one thing that had never once appeared in 10,000 years of records was a people that had refused and survived, and made the refusing beautiful. Do it anyway, she said. On our terms, light it. The Longstride crossed the marker and went into the Holy of Holies. It threaded the reliquary shell the way a surgeon threads a needle through a sleeping patient's veins, slow, exact, touching nothing. Adaeze watched the tombs of the founders drift past the gray hull on the chamber's magnified feed, 100,000 years of the honored dead sliding by close enough to touch, and the Longstride touched none of them. It slipped between the great silent arcs. It curved around the sealed monuments. It found the one clear lane down through the shell of the beloved to the smoldering face of the star, and it laid itself there, spine first. The long forward lance pointed down into the fire, one small gray ship poised over a dying sun like a diver at the lip of a well. Deploying the keel, Ray said. Stellar officer has the con. Ada, watch the pole. That's where it'll show first if it shows. The lance woke. There was no beam. That was what none of the elder species had expected. Adaeze would understand later. They had braced for a weapon, for violence, for the young species to stab the sacred star and take what it wanted by force, because that was what their 100,000 years had taught them to expect of power. But the Longstride did not fire into the star. It sang into it. The lance was not a gun. It was a tuning fork the length of a warship, and it reached down into the stalled convection of the Everlight and found the frequency at which a smothered fire wants to breathe again, and it held that note, and it poured the whole reactor of a human warship into holding it, steady, steady, a single unwavering tone laid against 400 years of stillness, and it waited for the star to remember how to move. Nothing happened. For 10 seconds, for 20, for a full slow minute that stretched out across the silent chamber, nothing happened at all, and Adaeze felt the whole hall of accounts begin, tier by tier, to settle back into its ancient certainty that nothing ever could. She saw Adaeze Sunder's crystal length catch the sick ochre light and hold it, poised, ready, she understood, to say the words it had waited its whole existence to say to the young. We told you the dark could not be beaten, we told you, and now it is done, and now you will pay. Then the pole of the star turned white. It was a single point at first, a pinprick of true fierce color at the top of the smothered sun, the first honest light that dying star had made in 4 centuries, and it grew. It bloomed. The stalled convection, tuned and coaxed and finally remembering, broke loose beneath the lid of sacred dust and came surging up from the core in a great rising column of fire. And where it reached the surface, the smothering cap of 100,000 years ablation did not scatter, did not blast outward, did not desecrate a single tomb. It burned. It ignited in the rising heat and went up as light, the accumulated dust of the beloved dead transmuting, in an instant into the one thing the founders had built the star to make. And the wave of it swept out from the pole across the whole dark face of the ever-light, white chasing away the ochre, gold chasing away the gray, the bruised dark filaments boiling away to nothing as the fire came back up beneath them. The ever-light caught. It caught all at once, the whole vast sphere of it, 400 years of dying undone in the space of 3 human breaths, and it blazed, not the sullen dying ember the whole chamber had learned to mourn, but the true hearthstar of the founder's own memory, a great steady lamp of white and gold that flooded the open vault of the Hall of Accounts with light so sudden and so clean that 10,000 of the oldest beings in the galaxy flinched from it, and then, one by one, tier by tier, turned their faces up into it. And the light fell on the reliquary shell. That was the thing that broke the chamber, not the star, but what the star did. The relit everlight poured its restored fire out across the shell of the honored dead, and the tombs of the founders, dark for 400 years, drank the light and threw it back. 100,000 years of the beloved suddenly gilded and gleaming and warm, resting for the first time in 4 centuries in exactly the glow they had been laid down to rest in. The founders were warm. The pilgrim's beacon burned. And under a sky that shone again, in a light none of them had lit and all of them had needed, the whole Hall of Accounts made a sound that no human had ever heard the elder species make. A long, low, resonant tone that rose from every tier at once, from Thren and Cephaline and Vorager and 10,000 others. A sound with no words in any language the translators knew, and the translators did not try to render it, because some things do not survive being turned into words. It was awe. It was the oldest beings in the galaxy discovering that they could still feel it. Adaeze Sunder did not say the words it had waited its whole existence to say. Adaeze Sunder stood at the floor of the Hall of Accounts with the restored light of the hearthstar pouring down across its crystal length, throwing back 1,000 fractured colors it had not made in 400 years. And the first accountant of the conquered looked up at the star it had been ready to let die rather than see saved by the young, and it was silent, because there was nothing left in its whole vast ledger to set against a lit sky. Ossuar of the deep reading spoke into that silence, and the old jurist's voice shook, which Adaeze had not known it could do. "The account is closed," Ossuar said. "Let it be written in the ledger no power may edit, beneath the light of the star that is burning as I speak these words. The warden's toll against humanity is void and was always void, for the ledger named humanity creditor and the conquered debtor. And the debt the order owed, the weight of the saved, carried against us for 19 years, is discharged this day, in full and forever, not in metal but in fire. Humanity called it in as a single deed. It relit our hearthstar. It saved the founder's beacon without disturbing one founder. It did in an hour, being young, what the whole conquered could not do in 4 centuries, being old, and it did it not by force but by understanding, and it asked nothing for it but that the debate end. The great gray head turned, slow, up toward the highest and coldest gallery, up to where a 26-year-old woman stood at the rail with 3 Ilmari and the light of a reborn star on her face. The debate is ended, not because humanity was forced, not because we were. Because there is nothing left to say beneath a sky this species gave back to us. Let the roll of this chamber be amended. Humanity does not sit in the highest tier as a tenant of the order. It sits among the peoples of it. And let its seat be marked, for as long as this chamber stands, by the light of the star it would not let go dark. They came to her after the elder species, tier by tier, down the long stair that had been built to make the young feel small. The Thren and the Cephaline and the patient armored Vorager who had not lost a war in 40,000 years. And each of them, in the manner of their kind, made to a 26-year-old human envoy some sign that Adaeze understood without needing it translated, to be the thing the conquered gave and almost never gave. Not obedience and not fear, but respect. Even Vayli's sunder came. At the very last, its crystal length dimmed and its chime gone quiet, and it stood before her a long moment in the light of the star it had tried to let die, and it said only, "The child read the codex, and then the child taught it to us." And it bowed not deep, not the full 16th degree, but a bow from the first accountant of the conquered to a species 300 years old, and in that chamber that was the same as a surrender, and everyone in it knew. Adaeze bowed back, exactly the correct depth she had after all practiced. Later, much later, when the meridian post had unlocked its clamps and the long stride rode easy off its flank, and the ring of threshold fell slowly astern, blazing now with its restored hearthstar, so bright that ships across half the reach would reorient by it for the first time in 400 years. Adaeze stood at the forward viewport where the whole thing had begun, and Raze came and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. "They ordered us to pay," Raze said at last. "They did," said Adaeze. "And instead we lit their sky, and made them thank us for the privilege of not being in our debt." "We answered them on our terms," Adaeze said. "That was the only part that ever mattered, not that we won the argument. That we chose the ground it ended on." She watched the hearthstar burn, small and fierce and steady in the black, the light of it falling now across the whole graveyard of the honored dead exactly as the founders had meant it to. "They built a staircase that only went down, Ilan, 10,000 years of it. Every species before us walked down it one clause at a time, agreeing the whole way, until there was nothing left of them to keep. And they were so certain we'd walk it too. They never once imagined that a young species might just refuse to take the first step, and reach up instead of down, and answer a demand for tribute by giving them something they couldn't have bought with 1,000 moons. The ambassador would recover, in time. The courier surgeon had gotten word from the ring's healers, and there was hope. The Ilmari had gone home with their scorched fragment of the kestrel to teach their children one more chapter of the story they had already carried 19 years. And somewhere in the ledger of the conquered that no power could edit, beneath the light of a star that was burning again, humanity's name was written for the first time not as a debtor, and not as a tenant, and not as a thing to be contained, but as a people of the order, marked forever by the light it had refused to let go dark. The Galactic Council had ordered humanity to pay. And humanity's reply had ended the debate, not with a weapon, and not with a signature, but with a lit star and a young voice that would not walk the staircase down. And in 10,000 years of records, in every account the conquered ever kept, there was no reply that any species had ever given that the oldest beings in the galaxy would remember longer, or repeat more quietly to their young, than the one a 26-year-old woman gave the day she turned a demand for tribute into the brightest star in the sky.